Chapter 68. Upon hearing this, Tisha immediately pulled out a lighter from his pocket. It was the one Xiao Zhao had lent him. He flicked it on and extended it toward Officer Li. Officer Li froze for a moment, then used his blood-stained left hand to shield the flame before leaning forward to light the cigarette. After a moment, he patted Xiao's hand. Huh! A thick cloud of smoke billowed out, and Officer Li seemed to relax a little. That feels better, Officer Li chuckled. Now, I'm not afraid to die. You wanted to tell me something? Tisha asked as he sat down opposite Officer Li, his expression turning serious. Officer Li didn't answer directly. Instead, Tisha, how did Ti and Tiandan Xiaojun die? They were killed by someone, Tisha answered without hesitation. After noon yesterday, they were beaten to death by the owner of this lighter. He then handed the lighter forward, placing it in Officer Li's hand. Officer Li looked down at the green plastic lighter, his expression somewhat despondent. Is that so? He looked up and said to Tisha, when that person killed Xiaojun in Tian, was there anything strange about it? Strange? Tisha stroked his chin as he tried to organize his thought. There were so many strange things that had happened. He simplified his account and told Officer Li exactly what had occurred the previous afternoon. He described the woman's bizarre physique and the puzzling poisoning, along with everything else that had taken place. Tisha added, oh, and before and after she killed them, I heard the sound of a bell twice. Upon hearing this, Officer Li raised the cigarette to his lips, trembling slightly as he took a deep draught. After exhaling a cloud of smoke, he said, when the bell rang, I was right in front of that huge display screen. What? The sound of the bell was so loud in my ears. It felt like the whole world had exploded. Officer Li joked. Do you know what appeared on the screen? Tisha suddenly remembered the screen displaying text for no reason. So he asked, what did it say? I heard an echo of framing. Officer Li said slowly. Word by word. Framing? Tisha muttered. Deep in thought. Last time it was bringing disaster, and this time it's framing. Officer Li passed the last cigarette from the pack to Tisha. What one? Tisha nodded, reaching out to accept it. Officer Li lit it for him with his left hand. I knew you smoked, Officer Li said with a grin as he tossed the lighter to Tisha. It's best to smoke when you're using your brain, right? Tisha didn't respond. He took the lighter and took a drag from the somewhat moldy cigarette. After being stored for so long, the taste was sharp and bitter, and this cigarette was no different. I haven't smoked in years, Tisha said. Yeah, it's good to quit. Officer Li nodded. Quitting's good for your health. He paused after speaking, and the two of them fell into silence. They slowly exhaled smoke, like classmates hiding in a bathroom back in school, sharing a cigarette. What about the second bell? Tisha asked. Did new words appear on the screen? No. Officer Li shook his head, cigarette between his lips. When the second bell rang, the previous text disappeared. Tisha thoughtfully stared at the cigarette in his hand, sensing that things were becoming increasingly odd. What does this all mean? Tisha asked. That bell wasn't a death knell. It was some sort of warning. That's something for you to figure out, Officer Li said helplessly, leaning against the wall as he took another drag of his cigarette. I'm just telling you what I saw. You have a better chance of surviving here than I do. Why? Tisha asked, a little frustrated. Why can't you survive here? Because I'm a police officer. Officer Li smiled weakly, raising his broken right arm. I lost this hand saving Lawyer Zhang. I didn't have to care about her, but I couldn't just let her die. But you, Tisha, you don't have any burdens. Tisha seemed to understand what Officer Li meant. This man had wanted to save everyone from the beginning. His principles had guided him throughout, never wavering, and those principles would lead to his death here. PXIA's face darkened as he nodded solemnly. Then he asked, you didn't leave me alone just to tell me this, did you? Yes. Officer Li's face grew even paler. Tisha, I have a secret. Something I've never told anyone. I don't want to die with this secret, so I have to tell you before I go. Then why me? Tijia asked, confused. You could have told Lawyer Shang. Because you're like him, both of you are liars. Officer Lee smiled bitterly, shaking his head. You don't seem similar, but if you think about it carefully, it feels like fate. Tijia took a deep drag from his cigarette, then said, Go ahead. I'm listening. Officer Lee stared blankly ahead, his eyes empty as he slowly began to tell Tijia his true story. For a full 10 minutes, Tijia listened quietly as Officer Lee spoke, revealing everything. TXIA's eyes flickered, unable to believe what he was hearing. Officer Lee, you really told such a big lie in the first game? Kaizhou asked, his lips trembling slightly. Tijia had felt that Officer Lee's story was strange, but he never expected it to be based on a massive lie all along. Yes, Officer Lee's eyes turned bloodshot in an instant. That was the biggest mistake I ever made in my life. Just a mistake. Kaizhou frowned and stood up, his respect for Officer Lee evaporating. You and that liar were working together all along, trying to help him escape. But you told us you were on surveillance. I'm not a perfect citizen, but the one thing I despise the most is crooked cops. Officer Lee tilted his head back, tears sliding down his face. Yeah, a crooked cop. Officer Lee smiled bitterly. When I came here, I wasn't surprised. I thought this was my judgment. What? Tijia frowned, glaring at Officer Lee. Maybe me dying here is my way of atoning for my sins. Before Officer Lee finished speaking, a sudden loud bell rang from the distance. Ding! Tijia turned his head toward the door, his face filled with shock. Why was the bell ringing again? What did the screen show this time? Officer Lee, as if he hadn't heard anything, reached down with his trembling hand, picked up the empty cigarette pack, and pulled out another cigarette. He rummaged through his pockets and pulled out a metal lighter. To PXIA's disbelief, Officer Liu lit the cigarette and smiled faintly, as if feeling relieved. Then he slowly lowered his head, murmuring to himself, Tijia, dying here is my atonement. Tijia froze, staring at the clean cigarette in Officer Lee's mouth. The situation felt utterly strange. Hey, Li Xiangwu, don't die yet. He rushed to Officer Lee's side, kneeling down. But when he checked, he realized that Officer Lee had already stopped breathing. He still held the cigarette in his mouth. In his hand, an old ZIPPO lighter